Welcome to Libyth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in ancient Japan with the Nihongi, the Chronicles of Japan. Today we take the first idea from Monday and go all the way in. On Monday we named the first theme, International Influence Shaping Identity. We touched on how the Nihongi was written in Chinese, modeled on Chinese historiography, and simultaneously insisted on the irreducible distinctiveness of Japan. Today we pull that thread completely, through the specific episodes in the text, through the history of the idea, through its parallels in other civilizations, and into the present, where the question it was built to answer has never been more urgent. Let me begin inside the text itself, because the most important evidence is there. The Nihongi opens, as all chronicles of this type must, with the creation of the world. The first 2 volumes cover the age of the gods, cosmogony, the divine genealogies, the episodes involving Amaterasu and Susanoo and Izanagi and Izanami that we recognize from the Kojiki, but presented here in a formal classical Chinese prose that is entirely different in register. The myths are ancient and indigenous. The language and form in which they are presented are borrowed from a continental tradition that has nothing inherently to do with them. That combination, indigenous content in borrowed form, is the Nihongi's fundamental rhetorical move, and it is announced on the first page. The implications of that move become clearer when you compare the Nihongi to the Chinese dynastic histories it was modeling itself on. The Shiji of Sima Qian, the Han Shu, the Wei Zhai, these texts organize Chinese history using the categories and forms that Chinese civilization had developed for understanding itself. There was no external model being borrowed. The Nihongi, by contrast, was using someone else's organizational forms to organize someone else's myths. And the someone else was the most powerful and prestigious civilization in the East Asian world. The act of using the Chinese form was not a neutral choice. It was a performance, a demonstration that Japan could produce this kind of document, that it had scholars capable of writing in classical Chinese prose, that it met the formal standards by which civilizational standing was evaluated in the East Asian order. The episode that most explicitly dramatizes the tension between cultural borrowing and cultural assertion is the one we discussed in the character analysis. Prince Shōtoku's embassy to the Sui court in 607. Let me stay with it longer, because it repays that attention. The letter Shōtoku sent to the Sui emperor began, in the version preserved in the Nihongi. The Son of Heaven in the land, where the sun rises, addresses a letter to the Son of Heaven in the land, where the sun sets. The formula is grammatically parallel and politically radical. It uses the Chinese imperial title, Son of Heaven, Tianzi, for both sovereigns. It organizes the world around 2 centers, East and West, Japan and China, one sun rising and one sun setting. The Chinese imperial system had no room for this. The Chinese emperor was the singular Son of Heaven, the axis of cosmic order around which all other polities were arranged in concentric degrees of subordination. A peripheral state sending tribute could have a king, even a prestigious king. It could not have another Son of Heaven. The formula, if accepted, would have dissolved the fundamental premise of the Sinocentric world order. The Sui court, as Chinese records note, found the letter impertinent. Emperor Yongdi reportedly said that this kind of barbarian letter should not be brought to him again. The Nihongi records the letter and does not record that response. That editorial choice is one of the most revealing things in the entire chronicle. a decision about what to include and what to omit that tells you exactly what the text was trying to accomplish and for whom it was being written. Japanese readers needed to believe that their civilization had asserted parity with China. They did not need to know that the assertion had been rejected. The confidence was more important than the outcome. Shōtoku's 17-article constitution, issued in 604 and recorded in the Nihongi, is another expression of the same tension. The centralization of all authority in the Japanese emperor, the subordination of Buddhist institutions and clan hierarchies to imperial will, the construction of a Japanese state that is organized according to Chinese principles of governance, but organized around a Japanese imperial institution. The borrowed framework is bent to serve a local political project that the framework was not originally designed to serve. That is intellectual appropriation of the most skilled kind. Now extend the lens. Because the pattern the Nihongi exemplifies is not historically specific to 8th century Japan. It is the pattern of every non-Western civilization that has ever tried to participate in an international order organized around someone else's standards. The clearest parallel in Japanese history is the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Japan had been forced into unequal treaties with Western powers after the arrival of Commodore Perry's fleet in 1853, and the Meiji government's response was one of the most systematic programs of selective cultural importation in modern history. Western legal codes, adopted and adapted. Western military organization, studied and implemented. Western industrial technology, imported along with the German and French and British engineers who could operate it. Western constitutional government, established on the Prussian model. Western formal dress, mandated at court. All of this borrowing was organized around a single, insistently Japanese center, the divine emperor, whose authority rested on the same genealogical claim that the Nihongi had articulated in 720. The Meiji slogan was wakon yōsai, Japanese spirit, Western technology. The structure of the claim is identical to the Nihongi's. We take the tools, we keep the identity. The parallel with Kemalist Turkey is equally instructive. Mustafa Kemal's project of modernization in the 1920s and 1930s adopted Western dress codes, Western legal systems, Western alphabets, Western institutional forms, and simultaneously constructed a theory of Turkish national identity that was emphatically particular and proudly different from the West it was adopting. The adoption of Western tools was not understood as Westernization, but as modernization, a universal process that Turkey was undertaking on its own terms, for its own purposes, from a position of sovereign self-determination. The tension between the universalism implied by the borrowed tools and the particularism asserted by the national identity was managed, in Turkey as in Meiji Japan, through insistence rather than resolution. What connects all these cases to the Nihongi is a structural insight. The moment at which a non-Western civilization adopts the formal apparatus of a more powerful civilization is also the moment at which it most intensively asserts its own distinctiveness. The assertion and the adoption are not opposites. They are responses to the same pressure. You perform your distinctiveness most loudly when you feel it is most at risk. Prince Shōtoku's letter to the Sui emperor is the performance of cultural confidence by a civilization that was in the middle of the most intensive period of cultural borrowing in its history. The boldness of the claim was proportional to the anxiety it was managing. The Nihongi's relationship with Chinese historical writing is worth examining more closely because it is more sophisticated than simple imitation. The Chinese Zhengxi tradition organized history around the concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that cosmic authority supported virtuous rulers and withdrew from corrupt ones, which could in principle be used to justify the overthrow of a dynasty that had lost its mandate. The Nihongi adopts the formal apparatus of the Zhengxi, the analytic structure, the classical prose, the moral evaluation of rulers, while systematically neutralizing the most politically dangerous implication of the Chinese model. In the Nihongi, the mandate does not transfer between dynasties. The imperial line descended from Amaterasu cannot lose its mandate because the mandate is genealogical rather than meritocratic. A bad emperor is a moral failure who brings disaster on himself and his people. He is never a sign that the imperial institution itself has forfeited its cosmic authority. The Chinese tool is used without the Chinese implication that bad governance could justify replacing the ruling house. The Nihongi borrowed the form of Chinese historiography while quarantining its most politically radical content. This is a more precise version of the general pattern, selective absorption, not the wholesale adoption of a foreign model, which would undermine the particularity you are trying to assert. Not the wholesale rejection of the foreign model, which would deny you access to the prestige and credibility the model confers. But the careful, intelligent selection of what to take and what to leave, organized around a clear understanding of what the indigenous project requires that the foreign model cannot provide. The alternative versions, the Arofumi passages, are another example of this selective absorption. Chinese dynastic histories sometimes include variant versions of events, but this is typically presented as uncertainty about what actually happened. The Nihongi's use of alternative versions is different. It is a display of scholarly access to multiple traditions, a demonstration that the compilers reviewed the available sources and made deliberate choices. The form is borrowed from Chinese scholarship. The function is adapted to serve the specific need of a court that wanted to demonstrate intellectual authority over its own multiple competing oral traditions. The borrowed tool is repurposed. Now bring this into the present, because the question is not historical. Every nation currently exists in an international order organized around standards of governance, of development, of human rights, of economic organization that were developed primarily by Western European and North American civilizations, and that are now presented as universal. The question of how to participate in that order without being defined by it, how to be legible to the international community while insisting on the particularity of one's own tradition, is the Nihongi's question in contemporary dress. China's engagement with this question in the 21st century is the most consequential current version of it. China has adopted many of the formal institutional structures of the international order: membership in the WTO, participation in the UN system, engagement with the norms of international law, while simultaneously insisting on a theory of Chinese sovereignty and Chinese development that is explicitly different from the Western liberal democratic model. The Belt and Road Initiative is not simply economic infrastructure. It is an argument about what development looks like when it is organized from a Chinese center rather than a Washington center. The insistence on Chinese characteristics in governance, in economics, in the organization of political life is the 21st century version of Prince Shōtoku's letter. Two suns. Two valid centers. South Korea's cultural exports, K-pop, Korean cinema, Korean television drama, are a softer version of the same argument. The extraordinary global success of Korean popular culture in the 21st century is partly a function of quality and partly a function of something more deliberate. A sustained national investment in cultural production that could participate in the global entertainment economy on its own terms, carrying specifically Korean aesthetic sensibilities into a global market organized around Western entertainment forms. The Nihongi's strategy, use the borrowed form, insist on the particular content, has found new expressions in every era. The form changes. The structure of the problem does not. What to carry forward from this theme? The observation that cultural borrowing and cultural assertion are not opposites, and that the most confident assertions of cultural identity often coincide with the most intensive periods of cultural importation. If you feel the need to insist loudly on what makes you particular, it is usually because the pressure to become something else has become acute. Understanding that pattern doesn't resolve it, but it makes it visible, and visibility is the first step toward navigating it with intention rather than anxiety. That's all for today on Libyth. We close the week the second theme, centralization of authority, and follow it to see where it leads. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week. At least we try.